Welcome back to SNS Grills. I'm Ricer with Dead Broke Barbecue. Today I'm doing some low and slow smoked pork belly, and I'm telling you, this stuff is good. Pork belly is a very flavorful meat. It's about 50 to 50 fat to meat, so it's perfect for any type of barbecue. And it's very forgiving, so it's a perfect cut for any of you beginners out there that want to learn how to low and slow cook. Today I'm going to actually slice this up. We're going to use these for some sandwiches. So for this cook, I'm looking for a little leaner piece of meat. We don't need as much fat when we're gonna slice it. And the great thing about pork belly is you can experiment with all different types of flavor profiles. Today, we're going for a little bit more of a sweet and spicy flavor. So I'm gonna use some hot sauce as my binder. We don't need a lot, just a little bit of sploosh on here and rub it across. And just use your favorite hot sauce. Rub down the sides. And to add the sweetness, we're gonna use some Meathead's Amazing Smoked Pork Rub. And we can cover this up pretty thick. Tap it in. Repeat on the other side, and the skin has been removed on this pork belly. Gluggity gluggity. And back on with some Meathead's Amazing Smoked Pork Rub. So the prep, it's pretty simple on this cook. Now this pork belly is just gonna set on the cutting board and sweat a little bit while I get my slow and sear kettle fired up. Now the setup for a low and slow on the slow and sear kettle is pretty dang simple. I have my slow and sear in here, and we're using the water reservoir today. I have 15 briquettes with a starter, and we wanna get that lit and wait till they get ashed over. And we'll just put one more briquette right here so it catches a little flame too. I also want to add 4 cups of hot water to the reservoir. This is going to help our kettle stay nice and moist. We'll wait till these ash over, and we'll be right back. It's been about 15 minutes and my briquettes are nicely ashed over. Now last night I cooked up some steaks, and I'm taking the remainder of the charcoal that was left over from that cook, and we're gonna put it in the slow and sear. And being that this is only gonna be about a 4-hour cook, this is a perfect time to use up that old charcoal. Just get it in and dump it as a base on the bottom. And we'll get in a couple good brand new ones too. Kind of level them off a little bit. And for today's cook, I'm using some cherry wood. Cherry always goes really well with pork, and it also adds a nice little color to your bark. Get a piece in about there, right across the whole trough. I'm gonna use the dripping griddle today because that catches all the juices that are rendering off from that pork belly. That makes cleanup a lot easier. You don't have to scrape out a bunch of stuff on the bottom of your kettle. But first, we're gonna close up the bottom vent for our cook. And then we'll just get our dripping griddle in, grab our grate, and the hinge side is obviously above the slow and sear. I'm gonna use my SNS 500 with 2 probes today. Turn that on, get 1 probe up through, and this is what we're gonna use to register our heat with. Somewhere right about there will work. Grab our beautiful pork belly, and we'll get that on. And I'm gonna put the pork belly fat cap down. And we kinda wanna dome this up because it's gonna get a little pooling right in the center. Keep it as even as possible. And our other probe we're gonna use for our meat, just to give us kind of a visual. I'm not gonna be too fussy where I'm putting it, but something like this just to give us something to monitor. Now, we'll put on our lid, and it's perfect timing because our wood is starting to catch a little bit. We wanna make sure that the vent is on the opposite side of the slow and sear. And we're gonna adjust this down to about 1/3 of the way open. And our smoke hole, we're gonna get that down to about 1/3 of the way open also. Now I'm shooting for 250 to 275 degrees on this cook today. Pork belly, it is a pretty forgiving cut of meat, but we still don't wanna cook over 275 degrees if we don't have to. Now if you get a little bit of a spike, don't worry, just close up your vents a little bit and let it tame down. Don't make any big adjustments, and also give it a little bit of time. If it doesn't react in about 15 minutes, then maybe back it down a little bit more or open it up a little bit more, depending on where you're trying to put in your temp. Now I'm gonna set a timer for 1 hour, and then I'm gonna come back out here and check on this cook. I've been cooking this pork belly for an hour and a half. At the hour mark, I did check, and I had to dump off a little bit of moisture on top of that belly. Now I've had that happen a few other times when I've smoked up some pork belly. The best thing is to take a little piece of wood and put it underneath it right when you start, because that'll dome up that belly and that moisture will run off. We didn't do it this time, but I'm gonna try to see if I can use this as a wedge. Now you can see, here's the pooling that I'm talking about. Now we're getting some decent color, but we're gonna go ahead and rotate this 180 degrees because this will help us get some even cooking throughout the whole belly. Here's where I'm thinking I take this little piece and we're gonna place it underneath this belly and try to prop it up so it doesn't pool now. Maybe it'll start to spread out and evaporate a little bit. So I'm not gonna spritz this at all. We're just gonna go ahead and run it for another hour. You can see I'm running an internal of 144 degrees. For this cook, I'm gonna run that internal temperature up to about 195, 200 degrees because we're gonna slice it. We want this to be tender, but we don't want it to be like pulling tender. Obviously, I'm coming up to a stall, so we're gonna set a timer for 1 hour and then we'll check on it then. I'm 2.5 hours into this cook and that pork belly is pushing 170 degrees internal temperature. Let's check out and see if we're starting to develop a little bit of bark. Might as well glove up too because we might have to rotate it. Oh yeah, that's much better. There's not a lot of juice on it, but as you can see, our rub really hasn't 100% set yet. And you can see where we had that pooling, that is just starting to darken up a little bit right now. It's only been an hour since we rotated it that 180 degrees, so we'll let it sit here for at least another half an hour. Starting to get a little bit of flame, so we better get our lid back on. So I'm gonna set a timer for another hour. I am gonna take a peek at the halfway point to see if we're starting to develop a little bit more bark. And then if it's starting to dry out a little bit, we'll give it a spritz. I'm using apple cider vinegar today because if I want to add a little bit more darkness, here's a little tip for you. Use some apple cider vinegar or apple juice. Because of the sugar in it, it will help darken up that bark. This is one great thing about a low and slow cook. You're not in hustle mode. You're not worrying about overshooting any temps like on a steak or even chicken or turkey breasts. We've got time. As long as we're monitoring our temps and paying attention to the slow and sear kettle, this thing will be knocked out of the park. I'm 3.5 hours into this cook and we're reading an internal temperature of 191 degrees on this pork belly. Now I'm not gonna wrap this pork belly on the pit. So let's go ahead and just check for some probe tenderness and see how we're doing. Well, we are starting to get tender. It's got a little ways to go and we're starting to develop a little bit of bark. Yes, this pocket right here, it's still not quite where I want it to be, but oh well. This shows you if you got any pooling, you want to get it off right away. But oh yeah, she's starting to loosen up pretty good. We'll get the lid back on it and I'm going to set a timer for another half an hour and then I think I'm going to be spot on. I'm 4.5 hours into this cook and we're reading an internal temperature of 195 degrees. This smoked pork belly is done. It's time to get it off the slow and sear kettle. Well, we've certainly developed a much better bark now, and it certainly is a nice probe tender. This is perfect for slicing up. But you can see she's wiggly and floppy, and that's perfect. I'm gonna take this pork belly and put it on some aluminum foil and let it breathe for about 5 minutes. I want this cooking process to stop. Then I'll wrap it up tight and then we'll let it rest for about 30 to 45 minutes. So the next time you see me, I'll meet you at the cutting board. This pork belly is rested for 30 minutes. I'm hungry. It smells incredible. It's time to eat. We'll get it out of the foil here. Certainly is tender. Love that. And it looks pretty juicy too. Now there's so much that you can do with a pork belly. Tonight we're just slicing this up kind of like a brisket. So any of you that haven't cooked a brisket yet, I say you try this first because it's a good practice run. Of course, pork belly burnt ends are awesome, but you can do so much more with this cut of meat than just bacon and pork belly burnt ends. Now overall, I've got some decent bark. That little pocket, unfortunately, I didn't catch it early enough, so that moisture kind of held us back a little bit. So remember that, if you've got any type of little pocket in the center catching some moisture, dump it out. So I'm just gonna go ahead, we'll slice it right in the center. Oh yeah, this is crazy tender. It's got a nice little smoke ring and you can see all of that fat is rendered out and it's juicy. I can see it. I'm not gonna squeeze it though. We'll slice up a little thicker chunk. Something about like that thickness works good, but oh yeah, look at this moisture. I hope this focuses in and you can see that this thing is drooling. Now what we're gonna do tonight is we're gonna slice this up, put it on some nice French bread with a little bit of mayo and a piece of lettuce. But this nugget right here is calling my name. So good. Tender, juicy, a lot of flavor. I can taste the meathead sweet part, and that Louisiana hot sauce is my spicy. This truly is low and slow barbecue right here. It only took about 5 hours from start to finish. Now there'll be a link in the description below where you can get the complete recipe on this smoked pork belly. It'll head you right over to SNS Grill's website. Now I appreciate you watching, but remember, 2 zones are better than 1.